The Committee on Homeland Security Task Force on Denying Terrorist Entry in the United States will come to order. First of all, thank you all for being so patient. Oftentimes you have to vote in Congress, and that can screw up our best laid plans. So we really appreciate you sticking with us. This is an important topic, and we want to make sure we cover it as thoroughly as possible. We're meeting today to examine the current terror threat landscape, how the terrorist diaspora will affect the security of the homeland, and what additional measures the U.S. can take to mitigate the threat. In the interest of time, the ranking member and I have agreed to submit our opening statements for the record. Without objection, so ordered. Okay. And with that, we are lucky. And the other members of the committee are reminded that their statements may be submitted for the record as well. And we are very pleased to welcome a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very, very important topic. Mr. Thomas Joslin, the Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Mr. Robin Simcox, the Margaret Thatcher Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and Dr. Colin P. Clark, Political Scientist at the RAND Corporation. Thank you for being here today. The witnesses' full written statements will appear in the record. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Joslin for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Gallagher and Ranking Member Watson Coleman, for having me here today. I appreciate it. Other members of the committee. I turned it on, yeah. What's wrong? I'm all right, right? Okay. So, just in brief, I'll try and keep this very quick. You know, there's a lot of talk now with ISIS losing Mosul and the push into Raqqa about its impending defeat. I'm here to sort of basically blow a horn of caution on that. I think that ISIS is a very resilient organization. We've seen them come back from defeats in the past. And I would say if you look at my written testimony, there are some points in there I would make very quickly. I don't even know that we know how many fighters they have left to this day. You know, and this is the type of metric which is very simple to ask, and yet if you look back through the U.S. government's pronouncements in terms of ISIS, where at the beginning of the air campaign, the CIA estimated they had 20,000 to 30,000 fighters approximately. U.S. military now says we've killed about 70,000 fighters in September 2014. So if you go by those metrics, it looks like the U.S. government is saying that we basically killed more than 2 times the upper end estimate of what this organization had at the beginning of the air campaign. I think that speaks. The lesson I draw from that is that probably we do not know how many total fighters they have, and that with all these sort of pronouncements that we're seeing about their defeat in Mosul and pending defeat in Raqqa, be very careful because they have enough personnel left to wage insurgency in the near future and ongoing. They're experts at guerrilla warfare. They've known this is coming. This is not something that they're going to disappear overnight at all. Second point is that they are now an international organization. In November 2014, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi announced that his organization now had so-called provinces around the world. Some of these, as I say in my written testimony, amounted to nothing more than just small terror cells. Others metastasized or grew into full-scale insurgencies themselves, whether they be in Libya, where they temporarily captured the city of Sirte, or as we've seen in the Sinai and a few other hotspots. So what that means from a terrorist travel perspective is there's a lot of focus on Syria and Iraq, but this is not an organization that is only located in Syria and Iraq, that their membership and their leadership is actually dispersed, and that they have what's known by the U.S. military and U.S. intelligence as external attack planners that are outside of Iraq and Syria who are capable of planning attacks against the West, including in Libya, where some of those plots have been detected. Another quick point on this is that you'll see in my written testimony that there was a recent report put out by Europol, which I think has some very fascinating statistics in it. That report sort of highlighted for me the fact that while the returnees are an issue from Iraq and Syria and elsewhere into Europe and potentially through Europe to here, although it's very difficult for them to pull off, although the returnees are an issue from these war zones, that actually most of the arrests that take place in Europe today are actually of people who are either citizens or residents already of European nations. So, for example, they listed in that report that in 2015, there were 41 arrests of returnees from Iraq and Syria. In 2016, there were 22. The total number of arrests in 2015 for jihadi terrorism-related incidents or suspected incidents was 687, and in 2016 was 718. In other words, this leads to my next point. The problem when it comes to terrorist travel is not just about returnees coming back from the battlefields, but we have now, unfortunately, a situation where citizens and residents of European nations, according to European statistics, are by far the more numerous potential threats. And for travel here, that raises the issue of a citizen in the UK or France or somewhere where it's easier for them to get on a plane and get here to potentially do damage. Finally, and I'll just wrap up. Every one of these hearings, I always sort of always mention Al-Qaeda. You already had another hearing on Al-Qaeda today, so I won't belabor the point. But Al-Qaeda is still very much alive. And there was a recent plot that was actually announced by the Department of Justice on June 29th, which I think is very important to keep in mind. They announced that after 2 years, they actually announced this plea deal that this guy entered into. He was from Ohio, and he actually had gone off to Syria where he trained for a few months and came back. And he was sent back here by senior Al-Qaeda operatives in 2014 to establish a cell to launch an attack here in the U.S. And this was under the radar. As a counterterrorism nerd who studies this stuff very closely, we didn't know about this for a couple of years, and the Department of Justice announces this on June 29th. To me, it's a lone case, it's an isolated case, but it emphasizes the fact that you're not just dealing with ISIS returnees or ISIS fighters who are coming abroad who want to come back and do harm. You also still have to worry about Al-Qaeda, and we can talk more about that.
Thank you, Mr. Jocelyn. The chair now recognizes Mr. Simcox for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Chairman Gallagher, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. The views I expressed during this testimony are my own and do not represent the official position of the Heritage Foundation. My goal this afternoon is to highlight the ways in which foreign fighters returning from Syria and Iraq pose a clear risk to the West. I will focus particularly on the European component of this phenomenon. There are 3 aspects to the threat which I will discuss today: the short term, the medium term, and the long term. In the short term, at least 5,000 to 6,000 Europeans have fought alongside ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other Islamist groups in Syria and Iraq. Some have already been killed in the fighting, and as ISIS's Caliphate in Iraq and Syria comes under more pressure, yet more will be. However, there's also an expectation that many foreign fighters will disperse, and inevitably some of these individuals are going to return to their home countries. There could be approximately 1,000 returnees just from the UK, France, and Germany. The risk posed by these returning fighters is clear. Members of the cell that committed ISIS's attacks in Paris in November 2015, killing 130 and wounding 368, had traveled to Syria from Europe, fought and trained with ISIS, and then returned to Europe to carry out an attack. This cell also contained ISIS members who had entered Europe from Syria after making false asylum claims. Those plugged into the same network then committed the attacks in Brussels in March 2016. It's worth noting that American citizens were killed in both the Paris and Brussels attacks. Clearly, the threat is not consigned solely to the homeland. In the medium term, even if these returning fighters do not immediately plan to carry out terrorist attacks in the West, that does not mean they are still not detrimental to national security. These fighters will not be returning into a vacuum. They'll be reconnecting with pre-existing Islamist networks. The UK, for example, has approximately 23,000 terror suspects on the intelligence radar. Those who fought in previous foreign conflicts, such as Afghanistan in the 1980s and Bosnia in the 1990s, earned gravitas and credibility as heroic returning members of the Mujahideen. This helped propel a younger generation towards radicalism. Take the example of a British citizen, Babar Ahmed. Ahmed, who pleaded guilty to terrorism offenses in the US in 2013, fought in Bosnia in the 1990s and then returned to London. True, he did not commit a terrorist attack there. However, he was able to leverage his experience fighting in Bosnia to become one of the key radicalizers in the entire country upon return. He inspired a younger generation of radicals to take up the fight. Moving on to the long term, entire families from the West moved to Syria to live in this caliphate. Furthermore, there have been children born in Syria to Western parents. So it's not just adults now returning to Europe, it's also their children. These children will have, at minimum, been hugely exposed to ISIS's ideology and most likely been indoctrinated with it. There are almost 500 children currently in Syria with connections to France. There are approximately 80 Dutch children born in the Caliphate, and as many as 50 from the UK. Europol has warned that ISIS will likely, quote, train these minors to become the next generation of foreign terrorist fighters. Knowing how to deal with the potential security threat posed by children of hardened ISIS fighters is a major long-term problem for Western governments. Furthermore, there is already a clear problem on this front. My research has demonstrated that by the end of 2016, there had been 34 ISIS or ISIS-linked plots carried out by teens or pre-teens in 7 different countries in the West. Chairman Gallagher, distinguished members of the committee, the risk that returning foreign fighters pose to the West is stark and will continue to be felt for many years to come. Countries impacted by this threat must continue to work together to mitigate this. Thank you for inviting me today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Simcox. The chair now recognizes Dr. Clark for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Gallagher, Ranking Member Watson-Coleman, and distinguished members of the task force for inviting me to testify today. My testimony will address 3 fundamental issues. First, what is the terrorist diaspora? Second, what are the implications of this diaspora, or more precisely, what is the threat posed by returning foreign terrorist fighters? Third, what can the United States do to mitigate the threat posed by foreign fighters fleeing the battlefield in Iraq and Syria? The term terrorist diaspora, as currently used, more accurately describes foreign fighters who traveled from more than 80 different countries to fight with militant groups in Iraq and Syria and who have moved on or soon will move on to other countries. While some of these fighters might go on to provide support to Salafi jihadist insurgencies, the part of the terrorist diaspora we are most concerned about are the foreign fighters who will move on from Syria and Iraq to participate in other civil wars or organized terrorist cells that plot to attack the West. So what is the threat posed by foreign terrorist fighters? I foresee multiple categories. The hardcore fighters will likely remain in Iraq and Syria and look to join whatever the next iteration of the group becomes. In all likelihood, ISIS remnants in Iraq and Syria will hide, rest, rearm, recuperate, going underground to reorganize before returning to wage the next phase of the insurgency. A second group of fighters are the potential free agents or mercenaries who will travel abroad to take part in the next jihadist theater, whether it be in Yemen, Libya, the Caucasus, West Africa, or Afghanistan. ISIS affiliates and local Sunni jihadists would likely welcome an influx of battle-hardened fighters. These fighters are the militant progeny of the original Mujahideen, the transnational jihadists that once filled the ranks of al-Qaeda and fought in Afghanistan, Chechnya, and the Balkans. A third group of foreign fighters, the returnees, has occupied much time and energy in policy and law enforcement circles. These fighters may attempt to return to their countries of origin, whether within the region to countries like Tunisia and Saudi Arabia, or further afield to Europe, Asia, and North America. This third group is not as homogeneous as it may seem. Just as foreign fighters who traveled to Syria and Iraq left for different reasons and fought with different groups, those that return will do so for varying reasons as well. The first subgroup of returnees might be labeled the disillusioned. These individuals went to Syria looking for utopia, adventure, and a pure expression of religious identity, but they found something far different. The second subgroup is the disengaged but not disillusioned. These militants, however, are still committed to jihadism. Although these militants might have grown disillusioned with ISIS as an organization, they still believe in the concept of jihad and remain committed to holy war against the West. The final subgroup is called the operational returnees. These are returning fighters who may attempt to resuscitate dormant networks or create new ones, recruit members, or conduct lone wolf-style attacks. They could very well be pre-positioned and seek to attempt an attack under the command and control of ISIS remnants in the Middle East. These individuals are the most dangerous and deadly. The threat is far more serious for Europe and the Middle East than for the United States. The same factors that make Europe so vulnerable to the threat posed by foreign fighters: geography, the overall number of citizens who travel to Iraq and Syria, counterterrorism capabilities, poor continent-wide information sharing and intelligence and law enforcement coordination, and the relationship between Muslim communities and host nation governments are those same things that present favorably to the U.S. The United States must continue to allocate sufficient resources to preventing foreign terrorist fighters from attempting to sneak into the country. This includes not only a stout defense of American borders, but also intelligence sharing with allies overseas, including European countries, Turkey, and other nations throughout the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. And while we must continue to prevent foreign terrorist fighters from attempting to return to the United States, we must also focus on the more likely threat posed by radicalization and homegrown violent extremism. Countering violent extremism has proceeded in fits and starts in the West, including in the United States. We have too little data to understand which programs work well and which do not. Continued federal support for ongoing and future research will be critical to making progress in this area, as will oversight, monitoring, evaluation, and assessment to discern which programs work and why. We are entering yet another period of uncertainty. With the dissolution of the geographic entity known as the ISIS Caliphate, new threats and challenges will arise. Hearings such as this one, and many others of its kind, underscore just how seriously the United States takes these challenges. The threat of terrorism can sometimes feel ubiquitous, and how we communicate about terrorism and terrorist attacks affects how Americans assess the risk of terrorism. It is important to keep a sober perspective. In short, I believe that the danger posed by ISIS to the U.S. homeland is real, but manageable, but also sympathize with recent remarks offered by Lieutenant General Nagata that with respect to ISIS, we have to conclude that we do not fully appreciate the scale or strength of this phenomenon. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. In the interest of time, member questioning will be limited to 3 minutes each with multiple rounds, if possible. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for 3 minutes for questioning. The primary purpose of this task force is denying terrorist entry in the United States, obviously, but what emerges from all of your testimony is, in my opinion, the urgent threat that our European allies, I think, Mr. Simcox, you threw out the figure of 23,000 suspects in the United Kingdom. Maybe each of you briefly, could you address what steps our European allies have taken in terms of identifying and fixing gaps in screening, border security, information sharing, prosecution, and where they might need to go?
I'll just add one quick response to that. One of the things in that Europol report that I pointed to, which I flagged for you in my written testimony, is that they're putting more investigators in the refugee hotspots, pouring in through Italy, the Mediterranean, Greece, and that sort of thing to try and figure out basically which ones are actually foreign fighters who are trying to use the refugee flows as a mask for their own operations, sort of as the Paris November 2015 attackers did. I think what Robin pointed to and some of the other statistics I point to in my report, the main problem here is that European counterterrorism forces authorities are overwhelmed. They're trying to basically look at a vast threat pool. They're trying to determine which ones are going to pop off at any given time. And the link I wanted to highlight there was that I think it's easier for European citizens or residents to get into this country if they wanted to come here and do attack than somebody who wanted to come directly from Iraq and Syria or possibly one of these other hotspots.
So the Europeans have got better at sharing intelligence when it comes to the foreign terrorist fighter threat. But where there hasn't been an awful lot of progress and where there's inconsistency is the non-foreign fighters, the radicals that are already in those countries. Say, are the Dutch sharing information with the UK? Are the UK sharing information with France? Often they can't because of the nature of how that intelligence has been gathered. So there's a real problem on that front. The screening refugees problem is still a major issue because of the scale of the numbers that are still coming in. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done on that. But I would just say in my conversations with European officials, they know that their capacity on this isn't good enough. They want help on it, and it's a real area of potential agreement and cooperation between the US and European partners who want to get better.
My conversations, I know the Europeans are working hard to build capacity in those areas, including training. But one area in particular, and I tend to focus a lot on the financing of attacks, is syncing law enforcement at the local level with the national level entities. A lot of these jihadis have criminal backgrounds. Sometimes these are guys that are petty thieves and criminals, and they're more well known to the local beat cops than they are at the higher level. So connecting those two from the grassroots up to the top is critical to figuring out exactly who these people are and how they may attempt to fund their attacks. We know how they funded their travel to Iraq and Syria. We're now concerned about how they might fund their travel from Iraq and Syria back home to Belgium, UK, France, Germany, et cetera.
Great, thank you. To my colleagues, 3 minutes goes quickly, so use it wisely. The chair now, but I do hope we are able to touch on both of your testimonies, touch on the Cubs of the Caliphate program and the role of children, as well as domestic radicalization, which is a real thorny one. But the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the task force, Ms. Watson-Coleman, for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your testimony. I think I want to follow up with what the chairman was talking about. You talked about the impact on our European partners. What is it that we can do that European partners would allow us to do that would help them in what really becomes a crisis for them, and that would therefore accrue a benefit to us by ensuring that what's happening there is documenting and is accountable and makes us safer? And I'd like to hear from each of you on that. I guess that'll be my 3 minutes.
Okay, real quick, I'll just say the U.S. is the best in the world at tracking the external attack network for ISIS, which are the plotters who are actually trying to send people abroad to commit attacks. Some of that intelligence, I would imagine, is probably highly classified and difficult to share. But what is imperative there is to try and identify the external attack planners and figure out any of the Europeans or Western citizens or people in their orbit who maybe have tied to their networks who then could be activated abroad or could be sent abroad for an attack. And that's sort of a key link, I think, in terms of the severity of terrorist plots.
I would suggest there are a couple of things. For example, one of the problems that European countries are having is when people, for example, from Tunisia have come into their countries illegally, they're having tremendous problems being able to send them back if they're national security threats. So any pressure the US can put on some of those countries to be able to get them to accept security threats from Europe would be a great help. Sharing intelligence where possible, though I know, of course, it isn't always possible, is very useful. Encouraging European governments to spend money on this, encouraging them to treat it with the seriousness it deserves, especially some of the smaller European countries. And I think overall, just taking a more aggressive and realistic approach to the issue, it seems hard to believe that Europe didn't before 2016, but I think that is the reality in some of those countries.
I think, as Tom mentioned, I'd echo the United States is the best in the world at screening, watch listing, and connecting what we're doing offensively in the region in Iraq and Syria with what we're trying to do defensively in terms of securing borders at home. One area I think that the Europeans could probably use some advice is in triangulating intelligence, right? So all the different ints that we know and talk about, SIGINT, HUMINT, and everything else, because it's got to be really a multi-int picture instead of looking at these in individual silos.
Current climate with sort of our leadership at the very top and the way we've been dealing with our so-called allies on the international stage has any impact at all on whether or not they'd be amenable to our assistance?
Well, there's a lot to answer there, Madam. I don't have time, but I'll just say one thing. The leaks that we saw coming out about the investigations in the UK around the Manchester Arena bombing, which is not directly tied to politics but is tied to intelligence sharing, did cause problems, and that sort of thing needs to be tapped down permanently.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Captain Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen of the panel, thank you for appearing. I believe that terrorists overseas that are identified as active radicalized Islamic jihadists should be tracked and killed. I believe we should identify and very closely monitor suspected radicalized Islamic terrorists, and if it can be determined that they're involved in conspiracy to commit actual acts of terror, then they should be arrested, prosecuted, and if convicted, incarcerated. I further believe that we need to stop or greatly interfere with the recruitment and radicalization efforts that are taking place as we defeat our enemy and it disperses, which is the essence of this particular hearing. They're recruiting new people, and this is increasingly happening in the digital realm. So this leads me to my question for you, Mr. Jocelyn. Do you believe that the United States and our allies are sufficiently monitoring and defending our homelands, our respective homelands as allies, regarding the digital realm, including monitoring social media, emails, etc., to stop radicalization efforts? The time has come and passed when a man would have to travel to a foreign land to receive training and jihadist training. It can be done online. Are we doing what we need to do to stop that?
I don't have enough time to give you a full answer. Maybe I'll do something in writing, but it's a mixed bag is the answer, basically. The FBI and others inside the U.S. do some amazing work in thwarting plots, if you go through their filings and legal filings, in terms of detecting email traffic and that sort of thing, and finding people who are radicalized and who are in communication with ISIS operatives overseas. There's some amazing work being done there. In terms of counter-messaging, though, however, and the digital websites and social media and shutting that down, however, I would say no, the efforts don't come close to being adequate to what they should be.
Thank you.
If I can find the ISIS propaganda sites, if Khalifa News 381 is suspended at 12:01, I know Khalifa News 382 is up at 12:02. Doesn't take me much to find it, you know. So they know that too, and so there are a lot of problems in that regard.
Would you be able to give this committee a more thorough answer in writing, sir, whereby we may examine your suggestions and consider them?
I'd be happy to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Bergen, for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Clark, the administration earlier this year instituted a travel ban that impacted mostly majority Muslim countries. What is your opinion? Do you happen to think that a ban like this only exacerbates the threat of foreign fighters coming back? And if so, why?
I think it's still too early to tell what the impact of a potential ban is. In general, I think it's a good idea to constantly reassess who we let into this country. So I do agree with taking a hard look and scrutinizing who travels to this country. But at the same time, there's a threat from countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and elsewhere that weren't included on the travel ban. So I think right now, again, there's also a lag effect in terms of a lot of this, how it's portrayed from a propaganda perspective. But again, a lot of things that the United States does is included in propaganda. So again, at the end of the day, I think I'd probably leave it as an incomplete. I think this is a period right now where we're in a pause, where we have an opportunity to look further and to see how effective this actually could be.
Okay. My next question for anybody is, if foreign fighters are returned to the U.S., by what mode or means do you think they will return? What's the most likely? Would it be, planes, airports, the port, through boats, on foot through that south border wall? I mean, if you're going to have ISIS fighters come to this country, by what mode do you think it would be most likely to come back?
I think the normal means that we all use trying to get back in the country, I think, is probably the way to go. Flights, that sort of thing. I don't see any data that's publicly available that says they're preferring one means over another, if that's what you're asking. So there's no policy justification for trying to block one means versus another one, if that's what you're asking, as far as I can tell.
Does anybody else want to chime in?
In terms of how jihadists or foreign terrorist fighters may attempt to infiltrate, yeah, I think most likely they're going to try to fly here. But again, it's often presented as a binary debate. I hear all the time that it's framed in terms of there's terrorists pouring over the border, or no, they'd never come over the southern border. I don't see evidence that there's terrorists pouring over the border, but at the same time, it seems logical that that would be one way to sneak into the country. And so my follow-up to that is always, if someone were to infiltrate the country through the Mexican border, is there an existing infrastructure in place that would facilitate some kind of attack? And I'm far more doubtful about that. So if they were to go through the trouble of getting here, then what? And I often don't hear a good response to that.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rutherford, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Clark, in your written testimony, you had talked about really three types of fighters: the hardcore, the free agents, the mercenary types, and then also the returnees, as you call them. I'm particularly concerned about the returnees who could come back to the United States. But Could you talk about the breakdown of what you suspect that might look like? How many will actually remain hardcore in the region? How many will, do you think, return?
Yeah, so it's difficult to quantify that, right? To say, I think 30% are going to stay, 20%, any number I gave you would be made up. I think, by and large, those that are committed to the fight, as we've seen in Mosul, have dug in and are fighting to the death. A lot of foreign fighters, including a lot of Chechens, have stayed, and they are meeting their death in Mosul. I think, again, due to geography, it would be difficult for those that wanted to get back to the United States to do so. So I think the second most likely category is probably the free agents or mercenaries who go on and fight another fight, whether that's in Libya, whether that's in other parts of North Africa or elsewhere. So I think the returnees are probably the smallest percentage, but as research by Thomas Heghammer and others have shown, those that do make the trip back that are trained are the most lethal. So while it is a small chance or a small percentage, we still have to obviously guard against that.
Right, and I particularly want to highlight that you said they're the most lethal, and which makes it imperative that we do all that we can to battlefield identify those individuals in all three groups, because as you said, we don't really know who will be in which group. But Mr. Simcox, can you talk a little bit about how we are doing as far as battlefield identification of individuals and getting them into the terrorist system so that CBP and others know who these folks are when they start to travel?
Well, certainly from a European perspective, they're very confident that they know who most of the people are who've traveled. They're never going to get complete coverage, but they're quite confident. I think one of the things to look for when you're trying to assess, and as Dr. Clark says, it's very hard to know exactly who's going to pose the most lethal threat upon return and quantify it. But it is worth looking, I think, at when people traveled. Anyone traveling to Syria after 2014 at the latest knew what he was or she was going there to get involved in. They knew what ISIS represented. You could make an argument for that maybe some of the 2011 travelers had different motivations. I think it's borderline, but you could make that argument. So I do think it's worth looking at the dates of departure and when trying to assess this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 3 minutes.
Let me thank the chairman for yielding and thank the ranking member as well. The witnesses, I was in a similar hearing this morning, so I'm just going to follow the same tracking of questions. And I like the opening statement that I'm reading that indicates the fall of Mosul and likely of Raqqa won't be the end of the Islamic State. And I said this morning that our responsibilities are clearly the securing of the homeland. So I'd be interested in your assessment of intelligence resources and how you think we should emphasize intelligence resources in terms of the preventative blocking or intelligence about how many recruits may return, or the idea of surveilling and determining. Obviously, we are a freedom of speech and thought nation. Those who may be radicalized right here in the United States off of social media. Mr. Jocelyn?
Just real quick, that opening line was from my testimony, and the thought that leads off
I was
from...
wondering if you'd recognize it.
I did. And main reason is because we're talking about the terrorist diaspora today, and I think Robin in his testimony emphasized parts of this as well. I don't think it's going to be a shotgun blast of a diaspora out of the lands of the Caliphate where you have to deal with it sort of all at once. I think this is going to be an ongoing problem for intelligence and homeland security officials, into the near future. And you have multi-layers to the problem. Yes, you have the perspective of a guy or a gal who basically comes back directly to commit an attack that day or that week or that month. That's probably a low percentage of overall what you're going to be dealing with in the long run. In the long run, you have to worry about those sort of second-tier threats, the people who are going to come back and do, as Robin talked about, indoctrination indoctrinating or recruiting a cell. There's an example I wrote up recently of somebody who came from Al-Qaeda in Syria back to Columbus, Ohio, or somewhere in Ohio, and basically he was setting up a cell to commit an attack. He wasn't even going to do it himself. That sort of thing is, I think, in the long run, what's going to basically take up probably more resources than it's probably appreciated right now.
Thank you. Mr. Simcox?
Well, I think you obviously need to take a broad approach to this question. The thing that I would probably drill down on is there's a lot of discussion at the moment around CVE. I've always viewed that, and we have a lot of experience with this in the UK, as something that I understand why people have to try and why government has to try to take that preventative approach. I don't have massive amounts of confidence in the program as it currently exists, and I do think there's an awful lot of improvements to be made. But even with improvements, that kind of program, I think, it needs to be in the toolbox for all the things you would bring to the counterterrorism, counter-radicalization discussion, but I wouldn't put huge amounts of faith in it.
I'd like Dr. Clark to be able to answer, Mr. Chairman, and then I'd like Dr. Clark, if you could comment on the importance of countering violent extremism as a component of our fight.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree with Robin there. I think CVE is important, but I think it's the literature, the academic literature, and I tend to base my judgments off of empirical evidence and data, is so nascent that we really don't know what works and what doesn't. You know, people are coming out of the woodworks now promising these CVE programs as if they were some kind of magic bullet or silver bullet, and I just, you know, I totally dismiss that. I think it's important to learn what works and what doesn't, but we're just not there yet. That doesn't mean throw the baby out with the bathwater. It means, you know, buckling down and getting some really smart people to start thinking about this in a focused manner. So, and again, it's one pillar in an otherwise broad, comprehensive counterterror strategy.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
I yield back, thank you.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Fitzpatrick, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I'll just address the question in the entire panel. It's the same question I asked Secretary Kelly when he appeared before us regarding visa waiver. So we all know the threats of entry through various mechanisms, whether it be the northern border, the southern border, the refugee program, the legal immigration process, as was the case with Malik regarding San Bernardino. But I want to address the visa waiver program for a second, to the extent that any of you have researched or put some thought into that. 38 countries, roughly, part of the program started in the 80s based on the Human Development Index, which is basically higher income countries. That was the old model back then. We live in a very different world in 2017 than existed back in the 80s. The threats have changed, and terrorism is no longer a regional threat. It is a global threat, and there's a lot of really dangerous people that live in really nice places like Copenhagen and Brussels and Paris and London, and there's some really good people that live in really tough places. The visa waiver program, I think last year about 70,000 came in. Currently, I think there's about 150,000 overstays. It's a dangerous, I believe, a dangerous situation we're in right now, when you have a lot of people that have been radicalized in Western Europe that can essentially come in through the waiver process that goes unchecked. With all the billions of dollars we spend on national security, that seems to be a glaring gap. So I just wanted your perspective on that.
Congressman, I know I have colleagues at the Heritage Foundation who have done an awful lot of work on the visa waiver program and are currently supportive of it, although recognized some of the threats that you outlined. I would like to be able to give you a fuller answer with written testimony, if that's okay.
Just real quick, this is there are many reasons why I don't think the travel ban, for example, works and is effective at all. This is one of them. So if you look in European nations in terms of how they say the arrests or threats have manifested there, in 2016, Europol says there were 718 jihadist terrorist arrests across the European countries, many of whom obviously have a visa waiver in effect. Only 22 of those arrests were returnees from Iraq and Syria. and 77 of the 718 were returnees from any battlefield, so Iraq, Syria, elsewhere. So 718 means that basically most of the threats that they're dealing with in Europe, who can more easily get into the U.S. via the visa waiver program from European countries, are actually already residents or citizens in Europe. And I think that basically that doesn't mean that all those 718 are potentially going to do that. All I'm saying is that if I were looking to plan something in the U.S. and I wanted to get somebody to go do it, I would use somebody who could get in that way because it's easier.
Mr. Jocelyn, could you provide the committee with that information when you get it?
Sure, it's actually it's in my written testimony, but I can provide more on that one.
I would just add to what Tom said. We're talking about those arrests, and correct me if I'm wrong, but those are people that didn't travel to Iraq and Syria. So those are Europeans that never left. Dan Byman had a piece in Lawfare either today or yesterday talking about frustrated foreign fighters. So in some senses, countries can be a victim of their own success. We spent a lot of time preventing people from going, right? But now they're home and they're still intent to attack or travel elsewhere to places, including the United States, to launch an attack. If I can just quickly, one thing we know about terrorist organizations is that they're highly adaptable. The Islamic State in particular has found a way around sending people from one battlefield to the other, and that's, as I'm sure all of you know, the virtual entrepreneur model, where they're using encrypted comms to get in touch with people that never left a place to actually direct them through every step of how to conduct an attack. David Gartenstein Ross and others have written about this extensively.
I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Garrett, for 3 minutes.
So I would thank the chair and Mr. Clark for providing a wonderful segue into the line of questioning that I have. I was a moderately decent soldier and a competent prosecutor, and I'm familiar with 18 U.S. Code 2332B, which makes illegal acts of terrorism transcending national boundaries and the concepts of conspiracy and attempt, which would allow the prosecution of individuals who might not have completed efforts to do these things. Mr. Jocelyn spoke earlier of an individual in Cleveland who had returned after having been involved with al-Qaeda, and Mr. Clark talks about individuals from other areas as well. I have read stories, obviously, of individuals from the United States who were arrested as they sought to travel to join ISIS. What I've not read is the proactive arrest of individuals who had been identified when they returned. Mr. Simcox, do you know of any instances where we've identified individuals who have traveled abroad to engage in or support terrorist organizations being arrested upon their return to the United States?
The United States, I'm less familiar with. Europe, certainly those arrests have taken place, but there's been great difficulty in translating evidence or intelligence from the battlefield into courtrooms, and so there's not been the success rate with convictions that European governments would have liked.
Is anyone in the panel, and this is open-ended, familiar with any sort of proactive reverse investigative techniques? And for example, we worked hard in a past life on those who might seek to use electronic communication devices to exploit children by creating individuals online who might appear to be someone who they're not, for example, a 13-year-old girl who was actually a 34-year-old detective. Do we ever engage in essentially chat room conversation with folks who would allege that they had traveled abroad? Does anybody know about anything like that? And if so, can you think of a good reason why or why not we might seek to do that sort of thing, Mr. Jocelyn?
Yeah, so one of the things we track along with Journal, the FBI's filings from the different cases, and you can see in those filings that they have undercover operatives communicating with people who traveled abroad or people who are suspected of being radicalized inside the U.S. who may commit an attack. The FBI clearly, if you just go through the filings, it's obvious to me they have a program to basically interdict or sort of go after people.
Sure, and with all due respect, I got 45 seconds. That makes me feel good, and I would argue, I would submit that perhaps the recent arrest at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii is indicative of this sort of engagement. But what I'd like to know is, given the fact that whether it's a local national, a U.S. citizen, or a foreign national coming to the United States, based on the current code of the United States, specifically 18 U.S. Code 2332, whether the current administration or the previous administration has done anything to round up folks who left to fight and came back. Because you give me the facts and I'll lock them up. Are we doing that? Anybody? Mr. Jocelyn?
As the way you stated it, probably not. No, we're not doing that, no.
But you would concede illegal to do that, and the statute of limitations is 8 years. Why aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, the FBI, I know, I'm not defending the FBI here, but I know the FBI does investigate these people or tries to anyway, on a regular basis. Now, that doesn't mean they're rounding up and arresting them like you're saying, but they are investigating and trying to stop people that they think or suspect are going to basically pop off.
Mr. Chairman, I'm 11 seconds over. I would submit that if we have laws in the books to arrest and incarcerate individuals who've traveled abroad to engage in or support terrorism and we're not doing it, somebody needs to whisper in the administration's ear. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now entertain a second round of questions, and I will recognize myself for 3 minutes. Mr. Simcox, I think you suggested there are 500 French children in Syria, 150 of which have been born in Syria, some 80 Dutch, and then Mr. Jocelyn, in your written testimony, you talk about this Cubs of the Caliphate program. Talk to us, just both of you, just to talk a little bit more about that phenomenon and what unique challenges it might pose to our efforts as a task force, because I think it's an underappreciated phenomenon right now.
Well, yeah, so the one of the complications right off the bat is the citizenship question of some of these children. Are they French? Are they British? Are they Dutch? Are they French Syrian? That's the first question that's being posed, and obviously what we do with these children when they return to their countries of origin. Are there any kind of de-radicalization programs that we could put them through that we're confident would work? I don't think there is. So in terms of this task force, this is a problem for 10, 20, 30 years down the line, where you have these children that have been, I think, brainwashed essentially with violent ideology, who will have every right to return to Europe and somewhere down the line every right to travel to the US. I think we need to be very, very wary of that as a potential future threat.
Just so real quick, one of the more disturbing videos I've seen of late, of the many disturbing videos we've seen come out of ISIS, starred four foreign children who were forced to commit beheadings of men who were imprisoned. And they were dressed up like the perpetrators of the November 2015 Paris attacks. So what happened is, before November 2015, some of the men who went off to commit that attack actually committed these brutal executions overseas in Iraq and Syria. These four children reenacted that scene on behalf of ISIS. ISIS made them do that. And the message in the video was very explicit. You're getting some of our guys now. We're raising a new generation to come after you in the future. That was the whole idea, and why they were dressed up like the Paris attackers. This is a massive psychological and security problem for the near future, mainly in Iraq and Syria, but of course elsewhere. This Cubs of the Caliphate program exists elsewhere. We've seen it in Afghanistan, we've seen it in North Africa. This is absolutely a form of brainwashing. Back in the communist days, in Maoist China and sort of thing, we've read up on this. One of the reasons they do this is they want to shock the conscience of the person to think that there's no way of coming back. That basically, if you commit an absolutely horrific crime that basically just violates all laws of human nature, then basically there's no way to come back from that. You were then indoctrinated for life. That's the idea behind it. That's part of what they're trying to do. And this creates a massive problem, and I'm not going to pretend I have the answers.
And then, I mean, as we look at the audience here today, we have mostly young people that are presumably interested in counterterrorism and national security. I mean, are we on the flip side? I'm going to go over my time, but that's okay. That's right. Thank you. Do you think, are we doing enough to get that next generation engaged and just recruit the best linguists, regional experts? Does our security clearance process hinder the recruitment of the best analysts and that sort of next generation of intelligence professionals and political warriors, if you will, although we've sort of lost the art of political warfare? Dr. Clark, I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so maybe I'm a bit of an optimist here, and in addition to being a political scientist at the RAND Corporation, I'm a college professor at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and CMU in particular is growing a program called the Institute for Politics and Strategy, which is really cross-cutting. It involves people that are involved in cybersecurity. As you probably know, CMU is a big engineering and computer science school, and so at least from my perch, I think there's a lot of interest from younger generations in combining international relations with cybersecurity, which is a huge need, a growing need for our country, with some of these other things like robotics, which could be used for the military in the future.
And we're out of time, but I just, if there are any recommendations from FDD or Heritage on that front, I think we would we would welcome them. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Ms. Watson-Coleman, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all of your testimony. It's been very interesting and very illuminating. I want to kind of take us back a little bit here. This task force is to deny foreign fighters entry into the United States of America. So I need to know from you a couple of things, if you don't mind. Is the threat of those folks coming to the United States of America low, medium, or high? What is it that you think we should do differently than we do now in terms of who comes into this country that should respond to that? And whether or not you think that that's our biggest threat, or should we be focusing on those who get radicalized here and never leave here but become a threat to us? So would you all three have at it for me? Thank you. Thank you.
Just very quickly, what I would say about this is, as our security systems are overwhelmed by domestic threats, both in Europe and here in the U.S., what I would say is it's a low probability event that a highly trained team of foreign fighters could come in here, but I think there's a higher probability to it than it's ascribed in the bureaucracy, is the way I would put it. And so we have to be very careful, because what's happening now with the FBI and the other security services is they're being overwhelmed by, the 18-year-old who's downloading an ISIS magazine in their parents' basement in Staten Island, okay? That guy may be a threat, but he's not necessarily deserves the amount of resources that he's being given. And this is part of the conversations I'm having, is sort of, I think there's a resource allocation problem that's potentially could be exposed here by our enemies. I'll leave it at that.
I would just add that I think that in terms of the plots, the most numerous are probably from the homegrown radicals that never made the trip to Syria or Iraq. But in terms of the potential scale of carnage, I would say the highest threat comes from those who have traveled to those conflict zones, fought and trained with these terrorist groups, and come back and try and carry out an attack. I mean, just look at what happened in Paris. I think the highest risk in terms of the body count, to be frank, comes from that kind of fighter.
In knowing the level of threat you think it is to our homeland, low, medium, or high. I understand what you're saying.
I would say I agree with Tom. I think it's a low probability, high impact event, though. So we talk all the time about black swans, the unknowable event that has a catastrophic impact. I think this is probably more along the lines of a gray swan, something that's eminently knowable, but we also have to do the legwork, connect the dots, and share intelligence and work with our partners overseas to put those pieces together. It's not a fait accompli that we'll just figure this out because we put a lot of resources into intel. We also have to do the hard work to get there.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Garrett, for 3 minutes.
So we have three intelligent people in front of this committee, Mr. Chair, or this subcommittee. And along the line of questioning I touched on earlier, Sweden recently made it a crime to travel to engage in terrorist activity and support. You talked earlier, I believe, Mr. Simcox, about encouraging Europeans to, and I quote, which is frightening, to spend money and to take this seriously. If the person with terminal lung cancer won't quit smoking, it's hard to help them. But I would open the floor, and we'll go Jocelyn, Simcox, and Clark in order, and I got about 2 minutes, to you gentlemen to suggest actions that would be appropriately within the purview of the legislative branch of the U.S. federal government that might further the goal of making our homeland safer from returning would-be jihadists, radicals, or anything tangentially or directly related there too. We don't have a monopoly on good ideas. What are we not doing that you think we might do more of within the purview of this body?
I have to review the laws. I'm not sure. I think you hinted at basically something that was not being enforced basically on the legal side, and I have to look into that a little bit more. If our current material support for terrorism laws are not being fully sort of leveraged to the extent that they could be, that maybe, I don't know if that's something that could be encouraged from this body or not, but that's something to look at. I think that there was a sort of a lag during the Obama administration on the full sort of implementation of material support for terrorism laws, and I would look into that, is what I would say.
Thank you very much. I would tell you that we looked at carrying a bill to do what Sweden did, realized we had laws on the books that could deal with that, but that they need to be uniformly enforced. And the answers to the questions I asked you earlier are, yes, we do that sometimes. But to the best of my ability to ascertain, no, we don't do it all the time, and I can't figure out why not. Mr. Simcox, what should we be doing differently within the purview of the legislative branch?
there is a clear need here to take on the ideology in a way that I don't think was done over the last 8 years, where there's a lot of talking around the problem. I think that taking the European approach, the language around CVE, the community-led approach, I understand the arguments behind it. I don't think there's any great success that it's worked, either in the US or in any European country, so I'd suggest we need to relook at that.
Thank you. Dr. Clark.
So I think before we jump to enact any kind of legislation, we need to figure out what works and what doesn't. I'm referring here specifically to the use of social media. So there was a big announcement a couple of weeks ago by some of the tech giants, Facebook and others, that they're becoming more active in shutting down websites and trying to discard jihadist ideology. And I'm just not sure, not because I think it's a bad idea, but I genuinely don't know if it's better to shut down the websites or to keep them up and running to
Mr.
monitor
Chairman,
them.
Dr. Clark, I think you made an amazing point. I also think that when we start determining what speech is and isn't acceptable, it's a very slippery slope. I do wish, however, we do a better job of differentiating how we treat American citizens and foreign nationals, because the bountiful blessings bestowed upon us by our Constitution and Bill of Rights, in my estimation, don't extend to those who come here to do us harm from abroad.
But I
Thank you.
see it as a form of open source intelligence and
Yeah, I agree.
mapping networks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson-Lee, for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. I want to pursue Dr. Clark thought of open source in form of securing, soliciting, or obtaining better intelligence. But let me indicate that, or at least pose a question about the weaponizing of cyber, and that now adds a different component to whether it's a returning fighter, whether it's somebody on social media. And the question I asked you all originally was the assessment of how we should focus our resources, FBI, intelligence resources, et cetera. And let me be very clear, a lot of resources are now being used to follow the tracks of the Russian connection, the Russian collusion, children of Donald Trump having conversations with known affiliates of the Kremlin, having just come back from a former Soviet bloc country, Belarus. There is no doubt that every effort that the Russian and Russian affiliates have to follow, track, undermine the United States, they will do it. Their leader is a KGB. So the issue becomes the choice and use of resources. Terrorism is defined somebody else's flowers, somebody else's terrorism. The question becomes, how do we allocate the resources? Do you consider the need for us to be able to follow both streams of potential threat to the United States and using heavy resources in both categories, following the Russian intrusion in the election, collusion with the election, trying to recruit or penetrating individuals that are close to the White House, and then, of course, the idea of a different component, a returning fighter or someone, if you will, becoming radicalized on the social network. Dr. Clark.
So let me say I'm here as a subject matter expert on terrorism, but to put on my international security hat for a second, I don't view these as different things. I view, to use kind of Pentagon parlance, the 4+1 threat. So both nation states and violent non-state actors as part of the suite or portfolio of threats that the United States faces. So I don't think that we get to choose who we get to defend against and who we don't. I think we need to take a broad approach to countering all of our enemies, and we're also moving into places like the gray zone and hybrid warfare. So again, it would be nice to pick and choose what we could react to, but again, we've got to do it all.
Anyone else?
I'll just say this on Russia. They are prolific at hybrid warfare and information warfare and cyber intrusions and all of these things. And we absolutely need to devote resources across the board to figuring out exactly what they have tried to do here in the U.S. and what they're trying to do to Western democracies writ large, because this is a sustained effort by Russia. It's not a one-off type of event.
And very quickly, on the counterterrorism side of things, There was a period, maybe a year, 18 months ago, where an awful lot of attention was paid to the social media side of things. I think the social media side of things is important when it comes to recruitment, but I still think that the key to this is face-to-face, individual contacts with people who know each other and draw people into terrorist networks that way. Online is important, but it's not the whole ballgame.
Let me just finish this point, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your indulgence. I agree with all three of you. And I guess that's the point that I'm making, is that we need to have pointed resources, Dr. Clark, that doesn't leave any aspect that may be a threat to the United States. And I'll just cite, I'm on the Judiciary Committee, the Department of Justice had grants that were going to educate local law enforcement to be a little, not a little bit, but to be sophisticated in ferreting out these individuals who may be in the community, are also being able to intervene. And I think that's an element that's equally important, because we're not always going to catch them at the water's edge, at our border. And if they're radicalized here, we need to have local communities being a little bit more informed. But my final point is, it is a multitask situation, and I hope that that is something we get out of this task force, that we need to be looking at Russia, and we need to be looking at those who may potentially come from the fight, start the fight here, because our idea is to protect the homeland. With that, I yield back. Thank you all for your testimony.
Thank you. I would love to continue questioning, but, well, since Mr. Jocelyn self-identified as a nerd, I'd love to continue nerding out with all of you on this topic, but we've kept you here 2 hours longer than we anticipated, and I want to be respectful of your time and everyone else's time. I thank you very much for your flexibility, your patience, and for your thoughtful testimony. I know you spend an enormous amount of time sitting in tanks and thinking, and would love nothing more than your thoughts to become legislative reality or policy that's implemented. And I just would submit that you have an opportunity to do just that, and I would hope that the three of you will continue to work with this task force as we go forward, and we welcome all of the ideas you have for, as we draft our report and as we continue to study this issue. We are trying to recommend concrete things that our government can do to do a better job of keeping terrorists out of this country, a very complex topic, one that you've all suggested we're going to be dealing with for years to come. And there are no silver bullet solutions, but we're asking you for your best ideas. And so please, I just would ask you to continue working with us and the staff here on that. And I want to thank the ranking member for her help and support. I want to thank everyone who showed up for this important hearing. I want to thank all of the young people that attended this. This is an important topic, and I hope you'll pursue a career in this field. We need you. And so with that, pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Without objection, the task force stands adjourned.